Hello and welcome to the CNSS Podcast. My name is Hamsini Hariharan and I am a non-resident visiting fellow at the Center for National Security Studies. Our guest for today's episode is Dr. Turnell. Professor Turnell is an honorary professor of economics at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He was a senior economic analyst at the Reserve Bank of Australia and the policy advisor to a range of international institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. From 2016 to 2021, Dr. Turnell worked as an economic advisor to the government of Aung San Suu Kyi and continued to advise her after she was overthrown in a military coup in February 2021. Following the military coup, Dr. Turnell was imprisoned along Myanmar's democratic leadership. After 650 days of incarceration, he was finally released in November 2022. Here is our conversation on his experiences in Myanmar and the country's economy before and after the coup. Dr. Turnell, welcome to the CNSS Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be on this podcast.
Thank you. You were Aung San Suu Kyi's economic advisor between 2019 and 2021. And so you were there for the coup, and I know that you had some difficult personal experiences. Could you walk us through what happened in the aftermath of the coup for you personally?
Yeah, certainly. So I was in Yangon, which is Myanmar's major commercial city, on the day of the coup. There'd been rumours about a coup in the days leading into it, but I must admit I was quite shocked that the coup actually took place, because there'd always been rumours of a coup like this, and it never happened, but now suddenly it had. So I heard very early in the morning, about 5 a.m, that the tanks had started to roll and that the coup was on, that Aung San Suu Kyi and her entire government had been taken into custody. I was actually staying in a hotel in Yangon, as I mentioned, but I was there sheltering because of COVID. In fact, I was under quarantine from COVID because I just recently come back to Myanmar from Australia. So I was there in this quarantine, heard about the coup, and then I faced a very difficult decision about what to do. Do I immediately try and get out or not? I dilly-dallied around a little bit too long, to be honest, because I'd been in Myanmar for such a long time, helping my friends do the economic reform over the last 5 years. So I didn't want to be the sort of person who just flees at a time of trouble, So I dilly-dallied around, which was probably a silly thing to do, to be honest. But as it turned out, there was really no flights out of Myanmar anyway, again, because this was right in the middle of COVID. So I was really stuck. And so 5 days after the coup, I decided by that point that I really should get out, but couldn't really get out because of the flight situation. 5 days after the coup, I woke up one morning very early to get an email from somebody from the hotel saying that military intelligence had taken over the hotel and that a CCTV camera was focused on my door and that it was time to get out. But of course, by then it was too late. I hurriedly packed a bag, went down into the lobby of this hotel, but just as I got to the concierge at the hotel, and of course, being a good economist, I was anxious to pay my bill, and just as I was paying the bill, extending the credit card, I could just feel the military police all coming in behind me. So they arrested me from that point, and unfortunately, that then sort of set my destiny in a Myanmar prison for the next nearly 2 years.
I'm so sorry to hear that, but on what charges?
Well, essentially espionage. So the official charge was that I had breached the Official Secrets Act of Myanmar. But funnily enough, and for listeners to this in both Australia, India and Myanmar, it's all the same law. In fact, it's the old 1914 British Colonial Official Secrets Act, which is still valid here, I suspect in India as well, and in Myanmar.
In India as well.
Yeah, so it's this old archaic colonial era law. So I was charged on that. And of course, the basis of it was that, and I should explain, of course, that I was over there in Myanmar as an economic advisor, appointed to the Myanmar government, but also with the support of the Australian government. So it was all very official and all that. But it meant for those past 5 years when I'd worked as an economic advisor, I was routinely handling documents and so on, because of course, in fact, half the documents I was handling, I actually wrote as part of my work. But it did mean that these documents were confidential documents to the Myanmar government. I was cleared to see them and all that, but the military, when they took over Myanmar, used that as an excuse to say that I had been engaged in espionage and that I had obtained these documents unlawfully and was sharing them with Western intelligence agencies. For some reason, they were fixated on the idea that I was sharing them with MI6. I don't know why MI6, because Australia has its own intelligence organisation called ASIO, and of course we're all familiar with the CIA and so on, but for some reason the military intelligence in Myanmar, when they arrested me, they were obsessed with the idea that I belonged with MI6. So I hasten to add, I was a little bit flattered by that, because maybe they thought I was James Bond or something. But any sort of flattering quickly disappeared, I'd have to say, once the seriousness of it became really apparent to me.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you could say that it's flattering on one hand to be, an economic version of James Bond, I guess.
Indeed.
Yeah. But how about the next 2 years for you? You spent them in a prison in Myanmar.
Yeah. So the next 2 years were pretty awful. The worst of all was for the first 2 months, where I was just locked in this windowless room that I used to call the box, because in size and so many other ways, it resembled one of those shipping containers. It was sort of like that. It was incredibly hot. The lights were on 24/7. There was no real window except a tiny slit window through which guards could observe me. But the only furniture in the room was a steel chair that was bolted down to the floor of the room that had chains attached to it, in which they chained me then when they interrogated me. So for the first 2 months, I lived in this room. It was the interrogation room. I had no contact with anyone, not the embassy, not anyone at all. So, yeah, those first 2 months were dreadful. Then I was taken out of there and placed into the general prison of Yangon, which has the most amazing name, just by coincidence, but the area where the prison is in is called Insane. So the prison is called Insane Prison, and it sort of summarised, an awful lot that went on it. But I was just placed there then for about the next 6 months, just in the general prison population, which of course for me was just extraordinary, because, I was a professor from Australia. I was a, official advisor to the government. So the thought of just being put into this dreadful old prison, which was well over 100 years old, and again, it was an old British colonial prison, and it was a dreadful, the physical conditions were awful. So I spent 6 months there. Then I was taken up to Myanmar's new capital city called Naypyidaw, placed into a different prison there, a much newer one, but actually the conditions were, if anything, even worse. But I was placed there with the other political prisoners, so with Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and with all the government ministers. We were kept together. So I spent a year up there while the trial took place. And of course, in Myanmar, if you're charged with anything, you will be convicted. So there was no surprise, when the verdict came. And then I went back to Insane for another 2 months before ultimately, and much to my surprise, being released and sent back to Australia. So, yeah, so the whole experience was pretty awful. The food was dreadful. The conditions were awful. About the only upside, I would say, is that my fellow prisoners, particularly the political prisoners, were just wonderful. Their support for me, their courage in sticking up for me. I don't think I would have survived without them, frankly, because, again, just as an academic, I'm not the most robust, practical person around. And my Myanmar colleagues, they just looked after me, basically. So in some ways, I experienced a window into some of the worst aspects of life, but also some of the best, because of the compassion and the courage of my Myanmar friends.
I'm so sorry that you had to go through this. It sounds horrifying, but I'm also glad to hear of the kindnesses that you face. I hope that other political prisoners who were there with you have also been released, or is that a high hope?
It is a high hope, Alex, Hamsini. So some have, but most haven't. So I'm still very concerned about a few of them who are on very long sentences. So probably about half have been released, and yeah, half are still there. Yeah, so I worry a lot about them. So it means that, while personally I'm, obviously very happy to be released and back home in Australia and all that, but the thing that hangs over all the time is what's happening to my Myanmar friends.
Of course, I can't even imagine how awful that must be. But is there a rationale for why they would release some political prisoners arbitrarily and keep
Mm,
others? Is it because there was sort of a push by the Australian government
mm.
and human rights groups
Yeah.
for your release, but for others as well?
Yeah, great question, Hamsini. I think for me, definitely, it was because of my Australian nationality, which meant that the Australian government was campaigning all the time. And so were many other governments around the world, including India's, actually. So I got an incredible amount of support from everywhere, so which I'm obviously immensely grateful for. Yeah, so it meant mine was sort of a bit of a special case because there was this extra tension. It was just an issue all the time. It would come up constantly, at meetings between Myanmar and the ASEAN, India, the US, Britain, everyone, so it would come up all the time. I think that the biggest differentiation is the ones who are still in prison are the ones that the junta, which goes by the name of the Special Administration Council, or SAC, the ones that are the exception, the ones that are still in the prison, are ones that they're frightened of, frankly. So Aung San Suu Kyi being the most obvious example, so that they were very careful to charge her with sufficient number of crimes, of course, none of which were legitimate in any way, but they added up to a sentence of well over 30 years. So there's a few people like that. So the ones that they've, as I say, that they've particularly locked away are people that they're frightened of. There's quite a bit of agitation internationally to have them released as well, but it's a little bit less sensitive internationally. So the SAC basically just continue to keep them in prison.
I'm so sorry to hear that, particularly about Aung San Suu Kyi.
Mm.
I heard that she hasn't been heard of in the last 2 months. And since you were a close advisor to her, have you heard of anything recently?
Yeah, no, so you're absolutely right, Hamsini. Yeah, so the last I heard of any sort of first-hand news is about 2 months ago. It's very, very difficult for any sort of communication. Her son has incredibly difficulty in being able to communicate with her as well. So yeah, so it's a real problem. Well, where I last saw her was in the prison in Naypyidaw, and the conditions she was under were not good at all. For at various times the regime has tried to make out that she's under some form of house arrest, but that in fact isn't true. She's just in the prison, and yeah, the conditions are just awful. So I worry a lot about her because she's 79 at the moment. She'll be obviously 80 next year, and these conditions would not be good for anyone, frankly, let alone a lady of 80 years old. So yeah, worry about her constantly.
Yes, of course. I'm so sorry to hear this. I can't begin to express, how terrible all of this is. I think
Mm,
we talk about human rights and we talk about, you know, these concepts in an academic,
yeah,
dispassionate way, but it is sort of lived reality for so many
yeah,
people.
yeah.
With that sort of as a very sobering background, I also want
Hmm.
to sort of ask you a little bit about the state of affairs in Myanmar even before the coup, because
Yep,
as an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, you had sort of a first row seat, is what I imagine.
yep. Hmm.
So between 2015 and 2021, um, what was the state of relations between Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing?
Yeah, not very good. So the relationship was always very tense, right from the beginning, to be frank. Min Aung Hlaing has a long and very bad record on human rights issues and so on. He was always someone not to be trusted as well. And certainly that was the case from Aung San Suu Kyi and her government. But even people within the Myanmar military never trusted him. So he was always regarded as a bit of a problem. Then, of course, things got much worse once some of the terrible atrocities took place in Myanmar's Rakhine state against the Rohingya. Atrocities that amounted almost to genocide. I mean, it was just awful. The civilian government tried to push back to the extent they could, but because of the constitutional setup, they had no control over the military. So there was no constitutional authority that Aung San Suu Kyi as state councillor, which was a sort of invented position for her, but legally and practically, she never had any control over the military. So, so it got really tense and awful after the terrible events in Rakhine, because Suu Kyi and the civilian government were trying to do what they could to stop that, which of course just soured relationships even more, and led, I think, to a lot of suspicion from Min Aung Hlaing with respect to the civilian government. I think he didn't trust that the civilian government wouldn't try and hand him over to the International Criminal Court and things like that. So, once those awful events in Rakhine started, the relationship, which had always been bad, just got dramatically worse. And so, I would say throughout that entire period from 2015 to 2021, as you say, well before the coup, the relationship, in one word, tense, I think just sums up the whole relationship.
Something that I'd also read about was that in 2019, Min Aung Hlaing had sort of threatened a coup if Suu Kyi didn't lead the Myanmar delegation to the International Criminal Court to defend the Rohingya genocide. So at any point in time, did Aung San Suu Kyi, did her council sort of feel that a coup was possible or could happen?
For certain, yeah. So throughout the entire period, I spent most of the time up in that city of Naypyidaw. Almost a week wouldn't go by where you didn't hear some sort of rumour about a coup. Now, obviously, most of the time it wasn't, but there was tension the entire time. There were times where it was apparent that there were flashpoints. There were periods where the relationship had really broken down to the extent that the rumours became very close to being true, and then ultimately did become true, of course. But I think throughout the whole period there were various events which got close to a coup, including the event that you mentioned, and then finally, leading to that coup in 2021. Which of course took place after a re-election, when Suu Kyi had been re-elected. And I think the military had started to fear that the civilian government, by being re-elected, would be able to have much more power relative to them. And so I think they really started to fear for their position at that point.
Was that the tipping point? Was it that Suu Kyi was also proposing constitutional reforms? Because you brought up the constitution earlier. So what would you say the tipping point was?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right, Hamsini. That was the tipping point, that armed with a fresh mandate and with lots of political capital, and also with much more of an idea about what to do about Rakhine State. So I think that led the military to thinking that they were up against something much more powerful than before. The government, of course, was much more experienced. It knew how to run things better and things like that. So I think for all of those reasons, I think it did become a tipping point. And so the military then felt that they, for whatever reason, that they felt they needed to move. But I say that there was a sudden realization from them that the power that they had enjoyed could begin to wane from that point on.
And also, what was sort of the Aung San Suu Kyi's relations with Western powers or India at the time? Because I remember there was a lot of pressure from Western countries over the Rohingya genocide. There was also criticism leveled at her that she wasn't doing enough. So what was those sort of dynamics look like?
So initially the relationship was incredibly good at the start of Suu Kyi's government, the National League for Democracy government, there was just so much goodwill all around the world. So the relationship with the West was great, with India was great, Japan, China, almost everyone actually. It was a real moment, you know. It did start to nosedive after Rakhine, and I think there was disappointment on both sides. I think many Western countries felt that Daw Suu or Aung San Suu Kyi and the government weren't doing enough. At the same time, she and the government felt that that Western governments particularly weren't giving them enough time and weren't giving them enough. Weren't giving them the benefit of the doubt that they were working to try and fix it. So I think there was a lot of disappointment going back the other way as well. With India, the relationship was very strong and very friendly. And I know that personally because, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi's links with India were very strong. She'd spent part of her schooling in India. Her mum was of course, was the widow of the Myanmar's great independence hero, Aung San, but she'd been ambassador to India in now I've got to get this right, in the 60s, I think. So her relationship, her affection towards India, Aung San Suu Kyi's, was incredibly strong. But also, again, at a personal level, I used to meet with Indian diplomats all the time, and even Indian intelligence people, Indian business people, and so on. And the meetings were incredibly positive. And it was just about the time that India had a bit of a look east strategy, and there was all sorts of early talk about infrastructure and things like that. And I know, you know, given subsequent events as well, one of the things that was always on our mind, and by our, I mean the economic reformers in Myanmar, we very much look to India as a bit of I know this is a bit of a cliche, but it's true, to look to India as a counterweight to China. Because there was and again, particularly after Rakhine, and the Western governments had begun to sort of, you know, distance themselves a little bit. We were very much looking towards India as a country in which, it could be a bit of a counterweight to China, because China was very interested in all sorts of very big infrastructure projects in Myanmar, but particularly big port facilities on the Bay of Bengal and so on. And we knew that they would be of concern to India as well. For us reformers, they were of great concern, because some of those big Chinese projects were very like the big Chinese infrastructure projects in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which, you know, turned out to be economically disastrous, you know, which meant loans defaulted, it meant collateral seized, which actually meant, you know, big port facilities falling into the hands of China and so on. So, there was a lot of mutual interest, if you like, as well as old affections there at the personal level. So, it was an interesting dynamic, actually, but I think a very strong and positive one with India.
No, I'm glad we've segued into sort of economics, because I want you to put your economic James Bond cap on.
Indeed.
Since we've touched on it a little bit, can you tell me how the Myanmar economy was doing before the coup, and what the effect of the coup was on the economy?
Yep. So the starting point, of course, when the NLD government took power, Myanmar's economy was very poor. You know, it's one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. Decades and decades of economic mismanagement. So when Aung San Suu Kyi and her government came in, they came in with a very strong, very bold economic reform program. But as we know, economic reform is really tough. And so, you know, it was tough going. And so there were lots of progress, I would say, lots of trouble along the way. For us economic reformers, we're always impatient. We're trying to push reform all the time. But we think we've been making headway. So the numbers were all pretty good, like from 2015 all the way through to 2021. Never once did GDP growth go below 5%. So we were making real progress. Foreign direct investment numbers were strong. We really got control of the budget, because traditionally Myanmar's budget had been way overspent and lots of money printing and all that sort of stuff. So we were needing to run a much more responsible budget. We needed to create a bond market. We needed to recreate the tax system. We needed to rein in wasteful government spending, but at the same time, you know, trying to push growth. trying to reform the bank. So, yeah, huge task, but great progress, we think, by 2020. Then, of course, 2020, COVID hit. So it meant we had to sort of turn not quite 180 degrees, but maybe 90 degrees in terms of loosening up the budget purse strings and things like that to run relief programs. And so, but then when 2021 came around, we were beginning to think, okay, we think we've got the COVID strategy pretty much down pat now, and we can return towards more longer term thinking, more reform thinking. So, yeah, we were feeling quite positive that we would, again, this very strong reform program would come back. And then that's almost exactly when the coup took place. So quite literally on that morning of the coup, the documents I was working on my desk were about the new reform program, how we'd be able to pivot again back away from sort of COVID relief back to really strong reform efforts. So to me, it was a pretty strong and positive story on the economy up to the coup.
And after the coup, what was sort of the shift? Because I imagine it to be a big one.
Just a catastrophe. Hamsini, and I say that like just being objective as I can, but and I think any objective observer would say that, because the reform program was completely dismantled. Even all the COVID relief was completely dismantled. So one of the big problems that happened immediately after the coup was that COVID rates just shot up dramatically. So Myanmar, which had been, very low infection rates compared to most countries in Asia, just suddenly experienced infection rates higher than just about anyone, as the military just dismantled, all the relief programs, all the programs of distancing and all the rest of it. Everything just disappeared. And then, of course, the people reacted to the coup by coming out onto the streets, and that became, the opposition became more and more successful. And of course, as they became more and more successful, the military responded with a very hard, the hard fist, basically, of essentially just shooting people at demonstrations and all that. But that meant that the regime just needed money because it needed to fund its struggle. Such was the success of the opposition that the position of the military became existential. So all of the resources then went into the military. But of course, that meant that all that spending, which had been going into health and education, infrastructure, improving electricity, all those things that we needed for better living standards and to drive economic growth, all of that was going into the military. It was all to buy advanced weaponry overseas and so on. So, so unfortunately, the economy just turned around. Of course, business confidence completely collapsed. Foreign direct investment completely dried up. So the biggest hit, 18% drop in GDP in 2021, and that just continued. And in fact, even now, the latest forecast from the World Bank for 2024 has Myanmar still going backwards, a -1% for 2024. So we think that the economy, and when I say we, here I'm talking about the World Bank and the IMF and all that, we think the economy in Myanmar is now half of where we estimated it would be in 2025, using very conservative projections of what growth rate would be. So just a terrible opportunity lost. And what, is so distressing for me is that another generation of Myanmar people will experience, really dire poverty, where, the trajectory before the coup was that they were going to be the generation that would miss the poverty, that they would have a much more hopeful position in life. But unfortunately, all of that's been taken away.
Unfortunately, whenever there is sort of any sort of military takeover or civilian governments, that is what happens. It never bodes well for the economy. What does that mean for sort of the central banking institutions, for key financial institutions that were also taken over by the military?
So banking, I'm afraid, is in fact, in all of this, I must apologise because it's all bad news. the banking system, of course, like banking systems everywhere, depends on trust and depends on confidence and, those ephemeral things, because money itself, of course, is just a unit of trust and that's all it is. And so, so the banking system is a terrible state. Myanmar's banking system has been in terrible state for a long time. And so one of the things we were trying to do under the reformist government was to get that back on track. But it did mean that the banks were very weak anyway. But now, after the coup, of course, with the economy, 50% GDP loss, many of those bad loans, which were there anyway, are just so much worse. So, Myanmar's banks, unfortunately, I would say most, if not all, would be insolvent, bankrupt, if proper accounting standards were to be applied. So that's the one thing. The central bank's in an awful position because it sits atop this banking system that it will be trying to save, but of course it's running out of money because, again, the government is just spending hand over fist to fund its military struggle. The taxation system, again, it has gone back to where it was, so it collects almost no revenue. There's no FDI, as I mentioned earlier. Economic activity is really low. So the government the regime there is once again needing just to print money. And so money printing, of course, and that's the central bank that does that. And whenever you get money printing, but particularly in the sort of volumes that we're talking about, you get inflation, price instability, collapsing exchange rates. So both of those things are very evident in Myanmar at the moment. And they're a real window, I think, into the state of the economy. If I could just pick on the exchange rate for the moment, if one would look for a summary of the situation, the Myanmar Jat, the currency, is now worth only 20% of what it was on the day the coup took place. So there's been an 80% fall in the value of the Jat, which is, if you were looking for one single number to summarize it, I think it would be that.
No, that's extremely striking. And of course, it's bad news. It is what it is. Something that I'm thinking about is also the sanctions that were placed on the economy. What impact have they had? And if all of this paints such a dire situation, where is the military junta getting the money to run the country or to run operations against various ethnic groups?
Yeah, look, it's a great question again. So the sanctions, funnily enough, because the damage has been so large done to the economy just by the coup and by the whole redirection of the economy into what is essentially just a war economy, the sanctions have probably had only a marginal effect, to be honest, because, and in fact, funnily enough, the regime's own sanctions have been bigger because, of course, that they want to keep all the foreign exchange for themselves. So there's all sorts of requirements now for Myanmar's exporters where they have to surrender any earnings that they get from overseas, and they get those earnings replaced with these low value Jat. But likewise, Burmese people getting money from offshore, lots of workers offshore sending money back to their families. A lot of that money is now disappearing into the regime. So so funnily enough, Myanmar's relationship to the rest of the world has been damaged so much by regime policies that the sanctions are almost, an asterisk, if you like, a footnote, and pretty much, and on the sanctions, I think most of the countries putting the sanctions on have done it in a sort of smart way now. So, for instance, there are no sanctions on the garment industry, which employs a lot of people and which would have a lot of damage. But where the sanctions are mostly levied are on transactions coming through banks, the regime moving its money around, things like that. So, so the sanctions thing is, I think the real correct measurement of the sanctions thing would be, are they having an impact on the regime and its ability to run its wars? And I think the answer to that would be yes. But which brings to your second part of the question, which is really important, which is that, okay, well, where are they getting the money from in all of this? And so I think that, and how they're spending it, that's twofold. One, as I mentioned, any sort of domestic spending is just money printing from the central bank, but with all the negative effects of that. But the other aspect is that, yeah, so they've been grabbing as much foreign exchange as they can from everyone, exporters, normal people, etc., plus spending down Myanmar's reserves. And they've been using that to buy weaponry basically from China and Russia. So that's where it's all coming from, in a sense. So the regime, desperate to get foreign exchange, China and Russia mostly demanding foreign exchange for the weaponry that they get, but there's a little bit of barter, etc., going on there as well. So yeah, so the overall thing is a mixed picture of the regime using anything they can get, basically, in this desperate struggle to survive. But they do have, if you like, some allies in the form of Russia and China. So it's even at that foreign policy level, the economics drives that partly as well. Myanmar, the regime needs Russia, they need China. They're being sanctioned by the West. They've given up on a lot of other countries, so their relationships with ASEAN are now, very compromised. With India are very compromised. But it's meant that the entire reorientation, if you like, towards Russia and China.
And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about sort of Myanmar trying to move away from Chinese sort of dominance in the
Mm.
economy pre-pandemic, pre the coup, and now sort of going back full circle.
Yeah. This is the incredible irony, that the military regime, when they came into power, one of their accusations was that the NLD government was too close to foreign governments, and were being, manipulated from behind the scenes. But effectively what they've done is made Myanmar now so dependent on China, and in fact it's an issue, apart from Min Aung Hlaing himself, it's an issue that my understanding is that some other people in the regime, some other military people, are actually worried about this, because the military people, like many other people in Myanmar, are always worried about China's dominance. It's been a fear in Myanmar, going back generations. So it is really interesting that whole issue that the military are there to protect Myanmar's national sovereignty, when in fact they've actually undermined that sovereignty very severely.
Mm. Taking stock of everything we've discussed over the last 40 odd minutes, we've reached a point where it's 4 years since the coup. Um, where do we go from here? As an economist,
Mm,
what do you think are the most likely scenarios for the Myanmar economy?
yeah. So it's all pretty dire for the short term, for those reasons that I've mentioned earlier, that really what the regime has at the moment is a war economy. So everything is just going into that. So that is very bad news for the rest of the economy, because it means investment, again, in health, education, infrastructure and all that will just go by the wayside. So that's awful. The only upside is it's almost an upside from the downside, which is that the economy is all at war, that the situation is really just a situation of all-out war. And on that front, the regime is very much on the back foot. So probably at the moment, this SAC regime control about half the country, but they do control the major cities still. So all of that's still under their control. But much of the border areas, much of the ethnic minority areas, for instance, is now beyond their control. They've suffered a succession of military defeats. So at that level, it's starting to look like, that they are yesterday's men. On the economic side, I've mentioned, all the resources pouring into the war, but they are beginning to run out of resources. They're running out of foreign exchange. The JAT, because of all the money printing and all of that, is beginning to lose value, or it has lost value, but at an accelerating rate. And so the situation looks very, very dire for the regime. And my assessment would be, if they had no support, the end of the regime would not be that far away. What I'm a bit worried about at the moment is that, and again, I'm afraid I have to go back to China, is that China has signalled just literally within the last few months to some of the ethnic minorities that are closely aligned to China. They've sort of signalled to them, look, we don't want to see the end of the regime. We want you to sort of stop fighting them. We want you to, get into a position where you're safe from the regime, but we don't want you to push on for the end of the regime. So that's sort of a worrying fact that has emerged just over the last couple of months, is that China has sort of let its allies, particularly within ethnic minorities in Myanmar, know that they want the regime to survive. Because, it's you can't really escape the idea, I think, that China has made a calculus that it wants a stable Myanmar, but it wants a weak Myanmar. And I think that bet then centres on, a military regime that is weak, but that at some point might bring about stability. I actually think China is making a bad bet. I think they've misunderstood the situation, because I don't think this current regime, this SAC regime, actually will deliver stability. So I think they've made a real miscalculation on this front. But but I don't want to be too pessimistic at this point, because I actually do think the regime is losing. I'm really struck at the unity and so on of the Myanmar diaspora around the world. So I've spent much of the last couple of years meeting Myanmar people all over the world, and the spirit, but much more than that, the practical financial support that they're putting behind the opposition movement is really extraordinary. Likewise, I think the opposition in exile, this national unity government and so on, because of course my experiences go way back to previous governments, deposed governments, but this one is so impressive. So I'm still feeling a bit optimistic, but I am very worried about the situation with respect to China, I think, above all.
Hmm. I'm glad that there is some space for optimism in all of this.
Yeah.
And something that I was just wondering if I could get your thoughts on briefly is the elections
Mhm.
next year, because China has
Right.
signaled its support for it.
Yeah.
Um, how do you think that would play out?
That's what I worry about most of all. What I really worry about is that with China's support, they'll run some sort of elections. They won't be remotely credible. But what worries me is that the bar that countries like China will be willing to live with is so low that I think that they'll run some sort of sham election. Maybe the top leader, this Min Aung Hlaing, might step aside or something, and they'll suddenly declare, okay, everything's fine, move on. And that other countries too, particularly some countries in ASEAN, might be willing to live with that. Again, I think that would be a massive mistake, because the real underlying issues wouldn't go away. So I worry about this election. If it was real, of course, I'd love the election, if it was a genuine election. But I think the sort of election that China would effectively run, because I don't think the SAC regime has the ability to do it. So China would have to be very deeply involved. But it would be an election to produce, again, exactly what China wants: a stable, weak Myanmar. I think they would get a weak Myanmar, but they wouldn't get a stable one. So the election thing, I really worry about that just about more than anything else.
I'm sure you're already advising the Australian government, but if you were advising the Indian government, if you were advising international organizations,
Yeah.
what would your advice primarily be for them?
So I think the main one, which I think the Indian government would get, would be, don't be taken in by this SAC regime or by what China might broker afterwards, because again, I do worry that China is going to have its hands involved in some sort of post-SAC government, which will just be a relabeling. So I think it would be to go in with eyes open. I think there are so many opportunities in Myanmar for India, but which could only be delivered, I think, but by a government in Myanmar that had Myanmar's interests at heart, not China's and not Myanmar's military. And, with that opposition side of things, those are the people that really would be looking to India as they did before, in terms of infrastructure projects and things like that. So so I would advise, if I was advising the Indian government, I would say to support some of the opposition as much as they could, but but above all, I think just to look out for what's happening, And I have no doubt that they would, because as I say, the Indian experts on Myanmar who I met were very impressive, and they knew the score, and I'm sure they still do.
Mm. Yes, I'm sure that the governments are going to figure out a way to deal with this in their own ways. I think one last question that I have for you, Sean, is for anyone who's sort of new to the situation, are there books or are there resources that you would recommend? I know that you've written a few and you also run Burma Watch, but is there
Yep.
something in particular that you would recommend to people who are new to knowing about what's happening in Myanmar?
Yeah, so apart from my own, what I would recommend, there's a particular organisation in the United States called the U.S. Institute for Peace, or USIP. So yeah, it'd be very easy to find. But they publish a series of articles that I think people listening to this podcast might be particularly interested in, because they delve in deep as to what's going on in Myanmar, but they have a special facility, a special knowledge, if you like, for the relationship between other countries and Myanmar. And so some things I've been mentioning about China and so on, a lot of really good stuff on that. So yeah, anything produced by USIP. There's a particular couple of authors from USIP, a guy called Jason Tower and a lady called Priscilla Clapp. Their stuff is very good. Some other, so it's a bit too soon to talk about really good books. So that's why I'm mentioning, articles that are coming out of USIP. There's also another really good think tank in Singapore, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, is very good as well. So that they've produced a series of articles out of that as well. So yeah, I think I would recommend any of those. There's also some magazines that are produced by Myanmar people in exile, and there's a particularly good one called the Irrawaddy. Which is always good to have a look at, to have a look at the situation on the ground, but from very much a Myanmar perspective.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Sean. That was very, very helpful, and thank you for your time speaking with us today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the people who are listening to this episode will too.
No, thank you. Look, it's been a real pleasure. I have a long personal history with India myself. I grew up and went to university with many Indian friends, and I came to visit them, and so I love India actually. And so I'm really happy to be talking. This is my first podcast to India, so I'm very happy.
Well, it's definitely not going to be the last one. I'm sure we're going to get you
Thank
on
you.
for very many, because I think that this is something that we should definitely develop.
Wonderful. No, thank you very much.
The CNSS podcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies. The Center for National Security Studies was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non-traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established by an MOU between MS Ramaiah University of Applied Sciences and the Army Training Command. You can find out more about the work at cnss.msruas.ac.in.